In this video I will critique William Lane Craig's reply to Jeremy Koons on the Euthyphro dilemma. But first, let's watch Craig summarize the dialectic.
Dr. Craig, the Euthyphro dilemma has captured the imagination not only of philosophers but of lay people as well. Even though it's very old, it goes all the way back to Plato, it has come roaring back, and a lot of that is because, well, for one, reasonable faith and yourself, you've found yourself in a position to address this dilemma many times, and it's something that you call a false dilemma. Give us a quick sketch, even though we've done podcasts on this.
For those who aren't familiar with it, the question is, does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? If the theist says that God wills something because it is good, then the good is independent of God, and in fact then moral values are not based in God, they are independent of Him. On the other hand, if you say, well, something is good because God wills it, then that would seem to make what is good and evil arbitrary. God could have willed that hatred is good, and then we would be morally obligated to hate one another, which seems crazy. Some moral values seem to be necessary, and therefore there would be no possible world in which hatred is good. And so the claim is that this shows that morality cannot be based in God. And I think it's clearly a false dilemma. There is a third alternative, which is to say that God wills something because He is good. That is to say, God Himself is the paradigm of goodness, and His will reflects His character. God is by nature loving, kind, fair, impartial, generous, and so forth, and therefore He could not have willed that, for example, hatred be good. That would be to contradict His very own nature. And so God's commands to us are not arbitrary, but neither are they based upon something independent of God. Rather, God Himself is the paradigm of goodness.
Jeremy Koons of Georgetown University has written a paper in a philosophical journal on the Euthyphro, and he claims that there's not a third option, and he critiques Adams and Austin and yourself as well on the Euthyphro, that it cannot escape the dilemma.
The argument that he advances is that there is an additional dilemma now that arises if you say that the solution to the Euthyphro dilemma is that God wills something because He is good. And what he will ask now is, are these properties like loving kindness, impartiality, generosity, are they good because God possesses them? Or does God possess them because they're good? And he imagined this as a dilemma. Now, it seems to me there's no dilemma there at all. The divine command theorist, and Alston in particular, is very clear. These properties are good because God possesses them. They are descriptions of the way God is, and therefore these are goods. And it would just be a subterfuge of the theory to say that God has these properties because they're good.
Why does Craig reject the option where God is good? Because He has the good-making properties. One reason could be, as Wes Morriston explains, then moral goodness supervenes directly on the good-making properties, and it makes not the slightest difference to their good-makingness who has them. A person is morally good to the degree that she possesses these properties. That goes for God as much as for anyone else. But then, we are right back in the box we were trying to get out of. God is subject to an independent standard of goodness. Another reason is that would violate Austin's particularist model, which Craig seems to endorse.
So, it's not really a dilemma. It's simply, as I say, drawing out the implications of Austin's view that the reason impartiality, loving kindness, love, generosity are goods is because these are properties of God.
The position that Craig holds will be very unintuitive to the atheist, as Wes Morriston explains. This implies that if there were no God who perfectly exemplified them, these properties would count for nothing. A person could be as loving and generous and faithful as you please and still fail to be morally better than a cruel and malicious person. Why would a discerning and consistent atheist have to think a thing like that?
But Koons finds that unacceptable. He thinks that this makes the affirmation of God's goodness meaningless. And he will often use the word meaning, that it has no meaning or that it's unintelligible.
Let us go over Alston's divine command theory to see why Koons thinks it makes God's goodness unintelligible. Alston distinguishes between Platonic and particularist predicates. A particularist predicate would refer to an individual. The paradigmatic example is the Paris meter bar. In this context, I think we can think of Platonic predicates more broadly as any predicate that is not particularist. An example would be a triangle. A triangle does not refer to any particular concrete exemplar.
Well, is there an illustration, Bill, that you can demonstrate?
Yes, one, in fact, that Koons talks about is the famous meter bar in Paris. The meter as a length was or can be taken to be defined in terms of the length of this bar. It's not that the bar approximated some abstract measure called a meter. The meter was just defined as being the length of that bar in the Office of Weights and Measures in Paris. So that would be a very good example or illustration. God is like the meter bar with respect to the good.
Consider these two propositions. 1. This particular length, L, is 1 meter because the Paris meter bar has this particular length. 2. The Paris meter bar is 1 meter because it is this particular length, L. On particularism, only one is true, and the Paris meter bar serves as the standard. On Platonism, only 2 is true, and there is a standard external to the Paris meter bar. Consider the moral parallel to the above. 3. These particular virtues are good because God possesses them. 4. God is good because God possesses these particular virtues. Since Alston's DCT is particularist, where God is the standard, 3 is true, and 4 is false, just as William Lane Craig affirms. As Koons explains it, when we consider why someone is good, we give details, such as having virtues. For God, we are debarred from citing any virtues, because these virtues are good, because God has them. God's goodness confers goodness on the virtues, and not the other way around. God's goodness is logically prior to the virtues, which is to say, God is good even without these virtues. Koons asks what that goodness consists in. Due to the logical priority, we are debarred from citing anything to give an explanation of God's goodness, so it is empty of content and unintelligible.
So what's the problem with saying that these qualities are good because God possesses them? Alston is quoted in the article as having said this: "Note that on this view, we are not debarred from saying what is supremely good about God. God is not good qua or as a bare particular or undifferentiated thisness. God is good by virtue of being loving, just, merciful, and so on." Now, Koons thinks that Alston is there contradicting himself, that Alston is claiming that God is good because he possesses these properties. And I think that's misinterpreting Alston. Alston is very clear that these properties are good because they are properties of God. What Alston is simply saying is that we can give some descriptive content of wherein God's goodness consists. These properties are good because God has them. So what properties does he have? And we can give a description. And Koons himself, I think, undermines his argument later in the article when he distinguishes between what he calls explanations why and explanations what. I found this to be a very helpful distinction, and I think it clarifies Alston's view. He says this: we must distinguish between explanations why and explanations what. Even if explanations why come to an end, you reach some explanatory ultimate. In the theist case, God, you can't get any higher than God. That is your explanatory ultimate. Even if explanations why come to an end, and no further reasons can be given at this point, it does not follow that at this point there can be no further explanation what. For we should still be able to explain what something is, even if we can give no further explanation for why it is the way that it is. And I'm amazed that he doesn't apply this to Alston's view of God. That seems to me perfectly correct, that when you get to God, you have reached the moral stopping point, the moral ultimate. There is no further reason why something is good. When you get to God, you've reached your metaphysical and moral ultimate, the explanatory stopping point. But that doesn't mean you can't explain what goodness is or wherein the goodness of God consists. And as Alston says, you can still explain to people, well, God is loving, he's kind, he's merciful, he's generous, and so forth. That would be an explanation what, but not an explanation why. So it seems to me that that just completely evacuates his objection of any significance. It's not true that God's goodness is unintelligible or meaningless. On Alston's view, you can give content to God's goodness by explaining what it is, even if you can't explain why these things are good, beyond the fact that they are properties of God.
This is where Craig misses Koons's point. Koons is saying the reason you can't use those virtues in the explanation what is because, on particularism, God's goodness is logically prior to those virtues. In other words, God is good without those virtues. So what is the explanation what of that goodness? Craig makes no rebuttal of this point, but it is crucial to Koons's argument. That is why Koons says the explanation what of God's goodness is empty of content, and hence unintelligible. This concludes the section about explanation whats. Craig goes on further, to make comments about explanation whys.
Bill, as we wrap up this podcast today, just a few things further about the Euthyphro dilemma. It seems that Koons and other people who study this issue are looking for a stopping point, looking for an appropriate stopping point for the good and to justify or ground moral values and duties. They just are trying to get it past God quite often. They don't want an infinite regress, but they just say that...
No, none of us wants an infinite regress.
Yeah.
And that's the irony of it. Everybody is going to have his explanatory ultimate in his moral theory, whatever that might be. And I think the theist has a very plausible explanatory ultimate, because the concept of God is the concept of a greatest conceivable being, a being which is worthy of worship. And any being that is worthy of worship, that is maximally great, is a very plausible stopping point for these why explanations and for being one's explanatory ultimate in the moral sense.
Craig takes the Anselmian view that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. Notice that a Euthyphro dilemma can also be applied to the great, rather than the good. I suspect Craig will say omnipotence is great because God has it. At that point we can run Koons's argument replacing the good with the great, with the conclusion that great is also unintelligible. And finally, Koons anticipates a potential response. In a last-ditch move, one might cite authors, like G. E. Moore, who have argued that the good is unanalyzable. But even if Moore was right, he merely meant that one could not analytically reduce the good to other non-normative or non-moral concepts. So, when Moore argued that the good was unanalyzable, he simply meant that it was not definitionally reducible. He didn't mean that it was inexplicable. So the divine command theorist will find no comfort coming from that quarter.
Darwin's greatest hits.